No one ever notices the smallest things until they matter, until a single, ordinary detail becomes the hinge on which entire futures turn. It wasn't the silver pen that rolled across the polished conference table that day, nor the whispered shuffling of papers, nor even the nervous tick of Elena's tapping foot. No, it was something smaller, softer, but infinitely louder to the one man who should never have seen it. If you've ever believed that the tiniest slip could change everything, you'll understand where this story begins. And if you agree that sometimes fate writes with the faintest strokes, then like and subscribe, because what you're about to step into is a chain reaction triggered by a photograph that was never meant to be seen. Elena Foster had spent the better part of 3 weeks preparing for this presentation, and her nerves, though carefully buried beneath layers of practice and professional polish, were threatening to unravel. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and lemon oil from the polished wood. The walls, all glass and steel, reflected the austere beauty of Hamilton Global's empire. A dozen executives sat around the long table, faces illuminated by the soft glow of tablets and laptops, their expressions guarded, analytical, the kind of faces that weighed futures with the same detachment as they weighed balance sheets. At the head of the table sat Adrian Hamilton himself, CEO, visionary, and the man who had built the company from a small Boston consultancy into a multinational powerhouse. His presence was magnetic in that unnerving way. He didn't need to speak to dominate a room. He simply existed in it, and the atmosphere bent to accommodate. Elena had prepared herself for this, or so she thought. She had spent sleepless nights refining her slides, rehearsing her data, anticipating questions about campaign performance metrics, and reminding herself over and over that this was her moment to prove she belonged, that the promotion looming just out of reach was worth every sacrificed weekend and missed family call. But what she had not prepared for, what she could never have anticipated, was the thin slip of glossy paper that fluttered from her notebook as she shifted her materials. It fell silently, almost elegantly, landing face up just inches from her hand, the image stark and impossible to ignore. An ultrasound. A baby silhouette in shades of gray, impossibly small yet monumental in meaning, framed by medical printouts and numbers no one else in the room might have cared to decipher, except Adrian Hamilton. Elena's breath caught as she reached instinctively to snatch it back, fingers trembling just enough to betray the panic she tried desperately to conceal. For a moment she thought she had succeeded, that the page had been reclaimed and the secret contained. But then, as she looked up, her gaze collided with his. Adrian's eyes were on her, not on the slides, not on the tablet he normally scrolled through with half-distracted efficiency during these meetings, but on her. More specifically, on the corner of the ultrasound that had flashed before his sharp eyes for just a fraction of a second. She tried to convince herself that he hadn't seen, that even if he had, he wouldn't care. And yet, the slight narrowing of his gaze, the subtle furrow between his brows, told her otherwise. He had noticed, he had registered, and he had recognized more than she wanted him to. The meeting continued, voices droning with metrics and projections, but Elena's heart beat so loudly in her chest, she was certain it must be audible. She spoke when spoken to, delivered her points with clarity she barely recognized as her own, and kept her trembling hands pressed against the cool edge of the table to anchor herself. She could feel his attention, though, measured, deliberate, not constant but never absent. Adrian Hamilton had always been known for his uncanny ability to see patterns others missed, to read between numbers and gestures alike. It was said he could walk into a negotiation and, within 5 minutes, know precisely where the weakest link in the opposing team was. Now Elena feared that skill had turned squarely on her. And it wasn't just the ultrasound he had seen, it was the date. She knew the risk the moment her eyes flickered across it before she shoved the photo deep into her folder. The date printed neatly at the top corner tied everything together in a way that left no room for coincidence. It wasn't merely the record of her unborn child's existence. It was a timestamp, a marker that aligned with another night, another story she had buried deep beneath her professional facade. As the meeting wrapped, Elena lingered just long enough to collect her materials, careful to stack them in an orderly fashion, as though control over her papers could restore control over her life. The executives filed out, murmuring about quarterly forecasts and campaign adjustments, until only she and Adrian remained. He hadn't moved from his seat, hadn't gathered his tablet, hadn't dismissed her with a polite nod as he often did. Instead, he sat there, the faintest trace of something unreadable on his face, watching her with that steady, unnerving calm. She forced herself not to falter, not to break eye contact, but her pulse betrayed her, drumming in her ears until the silence felt suffocating. "Good work today," he said finally, his voice smooth, even, deceptively ordinary. But the weight behind it was anything but casual. She murmured her thanks, slipped the last folder into her bag, and all but fled the room, heels clicking too sharply against the polished floor as she hurried down the hall. Only when she reached the relative safety of her office cubicle did she allow herself to exhale, her hands gripping the edges of the desk until her knuckles whitened. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let this happen now. This job wasn't just a career. It was survival, stability, the fragile foundation on which she was building a future for herself and the child she had sworn to protect. And yet, as she sat there, staring at the faint shadow of the ultrasound pressed into her memory, she couldn't shake the image of Adrian Hamilton's eyes catching that one detail. The date. A date that carried far more weight than he had any right to know. A date that tied him, inextricably and unavoidably, to a secret she had never meant to reveal. For 3 days Elena lived with the weight of his silence. She told herself maybe Adrian hadn't noticed, maybe the ultrasound had been nothing more than a blur in the corner of his eye. But the illusion crumbled quickly. He was watching her. Not openly, not enough for anyone else to see. But she felt it in the deliberate pauses when they crossed in the hallway, in the way his questions and meetings pinned her with a precision that felt more personal than professional. Each look was like a quiet countdown, and she knew he was waiting for her to break. By Thursday evening, the office had thinned to scattered lights and the hum of cleaners' vacuums. Elena sat at her desk, eyes burning from the glow of her monitor, when footsteps approached. She looked up, startled. Adrian Hamilton leaned against the frame of her cubicle, jacket undone, his expression unreadable. "You're here late," he said. She forced a shrug. "So are you." He didn't smile. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice lower now. "I need to ask you about the photo." Her pulse stumbled. She tried for denial. "What photo?" "The ultrasound," he interrupted gently but firmly. "I saw the date." The words landed like a hammer. Elena's throat closed, and she rose quickly, desperate to put space between them. "That wasn't yours to see," she said, trembling but defiant. Adrian studied her, and for once there was no polished CO mask, only raw certainty. "The gala," he said quietly. "The night of the merger. That's when it happened." Her silence betrayed her before she could form a protest. The memory burned, champagne toasts, exhaustion dissolving into recklessness, and a hotel suite she had buried deep as a mistake. Now the consequence stood in front of her, pieced together in his mind. His jaw tightened. "It's mine," he said, not asking but claiming the truth. Tears pressed hot behind her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "You don't get to say that. You don't get to decide anything. This is my life. My child." Adrian's reply was steady, almost quiet. "And do you really think I could look away? Pretend I didn't know?" She spun toward the window, staring at the blur of city lights, clinging to the anger that was safer than the fear. "I don't need you swooping in like some savior," she said. "I don't need pity. I just need to do this on my own, the way I've been doing it since the beginning." There was a pause, then his voice softened in a way that unsettled her more than his authority ever had. "This isn't pity, Elena. It's responsibility. I should have been there from the start." Her laughter cracked, brittle. "You left that hotel room without a word, Adrian. Responsibility wasn't on your mind then." His gaze dropped for a moment, something like regret flickering across his face. "I didn't know. I didn't realize what it meant. But now I do." She turned back, fire and exhaustion mingling in her voice. "Knowing doesn't give you a claim. This isn't a contract you can sign. It's not a deal. It's a life." He exhaled, stepped back, conceding space but not retreating entirely. "You're right," he said. "It is your choice. But don't mistake my silence for indifference. I won't turn away, not from you, not from the child." His eyes locked with hers, steady, unflinching. "Whether you want me there or not, I won't pretend I don't have a stake." Then he left, footsteps echoing down the deserted corridor, leaving Elena shaking in the quiet. She sank into her chair, pressing her hands over her face, fury and fear twisting together, because for the first time since she swore she could do this alone, she wasn't sure she wanted to. The days that followed unfolded with a strange, unbearable clarity. Elena kept her head down, burying herself in data models and campaign projections, trying to pretend that the air around her hadn't changed. But silence in a place like Hamilton Global was rarely empty. Colleagues whispered when she passed. Glances lingered too long, not because anyone knew the truth, but because something about her tension and Adrian's uncharacteristic watchfulness had begun to ripple outward. She could feel the questions building, like storm clouds threatening to break. And yet, when she walked into the nursery each night, when she traced her hand over the faint outline of the ultrasound picture pinned inside her journal, the real storm was in her own heart. She had promised herself she would do this alone, that she would never let anyone have the power to abandon her again. But now, every time she replayed Adrian's words, "I will not pretend I don't have a stake in it," she found herself shaken, not by fear, but by the possibility that he meant them. On the fifth evening, as the last light of the sun bled gold over the city skyline, Adrian found her again. This time it wasn't in the sterile glow of the office, but in the quiet hum of the building's rooftop terrace, where she had fled to breathe. He didn't approach with command, didn't lead with questions or accusations. He simply stood beside her, letting the silence stretch until she spoke first. "I never meant for you to see it," she admitted, her voice carrying the exhaustion of weeks, months, years of holding too much alone. "I thought if I just kept everything compartmentalized, I could survive it." "And you have," he said, his tone steady, without flattery, just fact. "But surviving isn't the same as living, Elena. Not for you. Not for the child." She turned to him, anger flashing before it dissolved into something softer, something closer to the truth. "And what are you offering?" she asked, weary. "A name? A reputation to shield us from gossip? Or something real?" For once, Adrian's answer came without hesitation. "I'm offering presence," he said simply. "Not to take over, not to decide for you, but to stand where I should have stood from the beginning. Beside you, if you'll let me." The city below flickered, lights winking on one by one, like stars learning how to burn. Elena studied him, searching for cracks, for the polished veneer of a man who saw life as deals and contracts. But what she saw instead was something she hadn't expected: uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, honesty. Slowly, she exhaled, letting the fight in her bones soften just enough to whisper, "Then stand." They said nothing more after that. They didn't need to. The silence, for once, was not suffocating but steady, carrying with it the fragile beginning of a different kind of future. Not one she had planned, not one she had chosen at first, but one she could begin to believe in. And as her hand drifted instinctively toward her stomach, Elena knew that the smallest slip had revealed not just the secret she had guarded, but the possibility of something greater than she had dared to imagine.